Eleanor Goldfield is the star of Act Out on Occupy.com and Free Speech TV. She's the founder and lead vocalist of Rooftop Revolutionaries and founder of Art Killing Apathy. She's a full-time activist, artist, and Eleanor travels the world advocating economic, social, and environmental justice. She's a staunch anti-war voice. Eleanor lends her support to any and every fight she can, including events, rallies, protests, interviews, and online. Her music is a mirror to her activism, and she has interviewed politicians, candidates, activists, and artists, and she's also been interviewed herself by people like Abby Martin, Lee Camp, Dennis Trainer, and others. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eleanor Goldfield.
Thank you so much, Bobby. So basically what I'm going to briefly talk about is creative activism. And the concept behind creative activism is using creative means to promote a message of socio-political change. That could be art, like visual art, like what you see behind me. That could be music. That could be poetry. That could even be things like food. It's really, creative activism does not just mean things that the stereotypical artist does. It means thinking creatively about ways that you can push for change. And this is sort of a twofold concept. One, of course, is that it's fun to be creative. And two is that we have to think creatively when it comes to working against the powers that be, because they are richer than we are. They have more militant means to repress us. And so we have to think creatively. One of the things that I wanted to bring up first was the climate camp that just happened in Germany. A group of about 1,500 people working in Affinity Groups managed to shut down the biggest coal mine in Germany, which unfortunately still gets 45% of its energy from coal. They managed to shut it down for an entire day using, several different tactics that I wouldn't have time to go through here today. But the underlying concept here was that they thought creatively. Even something as simple as an umbrella. An umbrella, although it's just a simple umbrella, can be used not only like the way Code Pink does for writing messages on the umbrella and then holding it up, but it can also be used in defense of things like pepper spray and tear gas. And those hurt like hell. So it's nice to have something to defend yourself with. So that is sort of the first thing that I wanted to discuss is affinity groups and then creative tools that you might just have sitting around the house. So affinity groups are something that have been a long-standing tool for activists. And basically what they are is they're small groups of about 5 to 15 people. In a larger group, let's say of the 1,500 that I mentioned, affinity groups are basically these smaller groups that are a part of the whole. So they still have the same goal and the same pathway, whether that be a physical path or a metaphysical path to change, but they work on their own. So for example, in this climate camp example, each affinity group had its own tactics. So for example, when all 1,500 were walking up against the cops, these smaller affinity groups were able to break out like little water droplets and go and get through the lines of cops, and were able to be more efficient and more effective because they broke out, as opposed to just a mass of people walking towards a wall, so to speak. And this concept is not just something that you'd use for physical actions. It can also be, affinity groups can also be something that you use for digital activism. Each affinity group does a different hashtag, for example. And then you have a larger link that you're sending people to, or every affinity group uses the same hashtag but has a different image. Something like this, things like this that can be very useful when you're trying to push for something and you want to try and get as many people on board as possible. You want to try and get through the cracks, so to speak. Affinity groups can be really, really great for that. So that, and then the whole like what you might have around your house, the umbrella I mentioned, or things like that, and also costumes. Code Pink is a really good example of people that use costumes. They've done several actions on Capitol Hill where they've used things like rubber gloves and sponges to clean away the schmutz of war and warmongering. They've dressed up like colonial colonial people, like, and delivered the Constitution to members of Congress who seem to have forgot it. And you might not have a constitutional outfit lying around, but you might have other things that can be used for creative actions. And if street theater isn't your thing, again, and this sort of segues into my next point, which is, what is your thing? And this is something that I talk about a lot because I think people ask the initial question, what could I possibly do? I'm not an artist. I'm not a painter. I'm not a poet. And that's great because not everybody can be. That would be a horribly boring revolution if everybody did the same thing. We need people like chefs. We need teachers. We need stay-at-home moms and stay-at-home dads. We need students. We need doctors, and we need every profession to bring their passion and to bring their expertise to the movement. And in that sense, think creatively about how they can help. Dr. Margaret Flowers is another example. She's a physician, and she has used her background as a doctor to bring to the table some creative actions when it comes to, wearing lab coats, or even something as simple as dressing up like a doctor and writing prescriptions for peace, or what have you. There are ways in every profession. There are ways to add your voice and to lend your expertise to whatever movement it is. And in that same vein, it is important to find an issue that really speaks to you. I personally feel that the overarching issue is money in politics, but that can seem sort of abstract and obtuse to a lot of people. It's not as tangible as, let's say, Black Lives Matter or women's rights or the environment. It is, however, the overarching the umbrella issue for all of those that I just mentioned is the evil that begets all evil. And if that's your thing, there's a lot of fun and games to be had when we're talking about corporate personhood. Backbone Campaign has done a phenomenal job of doing street theater and making props that sort of mock the concept of corporate personhood. So that is another excellent way of fighting that fight. If you want an issue that is, quote unquote, more tangible, then just find something that speaks to you. Because the whole idea, like these affinity groups, the people that are all on the front lines, we're not necessarily from the same background. We're not necessarily we don't all have the same passions, and that's good. Diversity isn't just important, it's necessary because it legitimizes movements. Diversity definitely legitimizes movements, because if you only had, white men calling for change, it wouldn't be as valid as if you had white men, Black women, you need that diversity because it legitimizes the movement as a global issue, a national issue, not just something that affects 1% of the population. So going back to that idea, you definitely want to find something that really speaks to you. And I mean, I'm assuming I can curse, so I will, because I curse on my show and in my music. I'd say Google that shit, which is something that I say on my show a lot because I don't necessarily have the answer. I know my own path, which came in a combination of music and environmentalism. Your path might be something like, just looking at food at the grocery store and being like, wow, that's fucked up that I can't find something that says non-GMO on it. Whatever your path may be, that's what you should latch on to, because just like a workout, and I used to be a personal trainer, so I sometimes think in that way. If you don't enjoy a workout, you're not going to stick with it, and you will never get the strength you want, or the lost weight or the gained weight that you are looking for. You need to be able to stick with it. So that is something that's really important when you start thinking about your activism path. And the other thing is to find a community. The issue that you're feeling, the feeling of oppression, the feeling of things are fucked up, they're not right, you're so not alone in that. I know sometimes it can feel that way because media, entertainment industries, basically the entire advertising world that encompasses us. And we take in between 1,000 and 3,000 ads a day telling us that we're not good enough, that we aren't slim enough, that we aren't smart enough. And that can really weigh down on people. And so you need to find a community of people that are also like, this is not cool. I don't want this. And then you guys can build something on your own, and then you can feed into an existing movement, or you can just feed into an existing movement. Again, the paths are so diverse, as they should be. So just to sort of round this out, I think sort of like the how-to, besides Googling that shit, I think is really just starting to think creatively. And I know that sounds sort of abstract, like how would I possibly just start thinking creatively if you don't consider yourself a creative person? Think about what's going on. Again, like what your issue is. Think about what's going on and think about how you'd like to see that change. So for example, if you find that your issue is the school to prison pipeline, and you think, well, it's really fucked up that kids are getting sent to prisons instead of schools. It's fucked up that we spend more money on prisons than we do on education. And how would you like to see that change? Well, obviously you'd like to see those roles reversed. You'd like to see us spending more money on education than on prisons. Okay, well, what's a way that you can do that? Sure, you can lobby your congressman, but is that enough? I mean, if they're bought and sold and if they're getting paid by CCA, which is one of the biggest owners of private prisons in the country, are they going to listen to you? Maybe you need to get creative. Maybe you need to visit them. Maybe you need to hold a vigil, in wearing prison outfits. Orange is the new black, do something like that. Just start spitballing. And, I interviewed Allie McCracken with Code Pink a couple of weeks ago, and something she said really resonated. Nothing is a bad idea until you come to the point where you're editing your ideas. So just throw a bunch of ideas out there, and not all of them will stick, but like a lot of comedians will say, they will write 14 jokes and then 2 of them actually make it, but they have to write those 14 jokes. So start by spitballing ideas and just throw them out there. And even if it sounds really, really crazy, it might be exactly what you need. And that might be the birth of an idea that can grow and become something bigger and more effective. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of creative activism and the how-to and following your passion to affect change.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. That's great as always. I have a lot of respect for you. You spent a lot of time doing exactly what you're doing, making sure the world knows that something's going on and inspiring them to participate. And we do have some questions for you that we'd like you to share your thoughts on. One of your organizations that you're deeply involved with, Art Killing Apathy, and I personally am familiar with it. Can you, I guess, first tell us how you came up with that concept? Because you've talked about a lot of it already on when people see something, get creative. But your feelings about apathy in our society and the ways to battle it. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Basically, I think that apathy is a cancer of the mind. And actually, that's what the painting behind me says. It is, there's no such, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's basically like, it's not the fact that people are doing the wrong thing or that people are doing the right thing. Nothing. And that's really going to be the downfall of our civilization, is going to be the people sitting in their living rooms on their couches with their McDonald's watching Fox News. And I know that's a very hyperbolic picture of the downfall of humanity. But I really think that, and you see this happened after, the 70s, the era of extreme activism. People got really disillusioned. RFK, JFK, MLK all died preaching and trying to change the world. And people got disillusioned. They were like, oh, well, fuck it, it doesn't matter. And then you see the rise of neoliberalism. And you see the issues that we have today that we're battling so intensely that we're sort of like, oh shit, we've been asleep for so long. Now everybody has to scramble. And I think one of the ways to scramble is to create art, because art is something that speaks to everybody, regardless of race, religion, your social background. It doesn't matter who you are, art speaks to you in some way. It might be a different type of art, it might be a different genre of music, but it will speak to you. And so I think that's the concept behind Art Killing Apathy. It is that art has the ability to bring people together and send them a message in sort of this non-confrontational way without preaching to them, without telling them how they should think. It's just telling them to think. And I do think that a lot of people are really smart. Some are like, Trump, and they're just idiots. But some people are actually like very intelligent. They just need to be presented with information, and they will get there on their own. And when people get there on their own, like through art, is far more powerful and long-standing than if you try to force them to take in information and tell them how to think.
Yeah, fantastic. And there's a question in our chat room, comes from one of the members of Solutions Institute, actually, that I was just reading here and think is very important. It says here, are there some brain exercises you would recommend to get oneself to think creatively? I consider myself a very linear thinker, but something like that umbrella idea, for example, to block tear gas would have really worked in Ferguson. And I wish we knew it then, because some of us were in Ferguson, some of the people were in Ferguson on that protesting.
So I couldn't quite hear the beginning. What are some other examples of the umbrella?
Are there some brain exercises you would recommend to get oneself to think creatively? Because I consider myself a very, very linear thinker.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that did it for me was that I just sort of walked around my apartment and looked at things, and sort of put them. I think, and I'm sort of half and half. Like half, I was also a tech, so I did a lot of like linear thinking in terms of fixing gear. So I sort of understand that, and I think for me it has a lot to do with context. If I'm prepping for an action, or even if you're just thinking of a hypothetical action, and you walk around your apartment and look at things and think, how could this be useful? How could that be useful? It just sort of putting these objects into the context of a rally, of an action, and then they sort of take on their own. It sort of grows in your mind almost organically. Outside of that, I would just look up other actions that people have done. I mean, that's where I've gotten a lot of my ideas. When I was doing a lot of actions in LA, it was, how have other people done this? Even back to like the suffragette movement, look for ideas that have been effective, that made it to the newspapers, because those are the ones that have the higher likelihood of getting yours into the newspapers.
Fantastic. I've noticed recently in your career, you've done some events. You recently were involved with hosting an art event where multiple types of artists were displayed, visual, music, poetry, etc. And I wanted you to talk about the importance of trying to get a community-based action like that, even if it's diverse, so from a coalition standpoint.
So you mean like how to go about creating an action like that, or an event?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, basically, I think it's important to first get to know that market a little bit better. I mean, it was relatively easy for me because the last one I did was in LA, and I lived there for 10 years. So I had contacts built up, and I knew kind of where I wanted it to be. But I'm planning another one in New York, and I'm planning another one here in DC. And there, I think it's really important for people to go to people that know more than them. And I think sometimes it can be a fault of activists that we get so into our own heads that we're like, no, I have to do everything, and I'm going to figure it out, and I know what I'm looking for exactly. And that's fine that you know what you're looking for, but there are people that might have the answer for you, and then that might like cut down 50% of the work that you have to do trying to find it yourself. So I think it's really important to build those alliances, and this sort of goes back to the idea that diversity is not just important; it's necessary for these movements. You need to have people with different ideas, with different backgrounds, because it legitimizes even an event. So I was working with people who had different mediums for their art. And that forced me to think in a different way. Like, oh, of course I need to think about lighting because there's going to be visual art. And I mean, I wouldn't think about that. I'm used to playing in rock clubs where you can't see your own feet. So, I mean, even something as simple as that is really important to work with other people. And in terms of actually doing it in a space, I think it's also important that you think about the area. I purposely did mine in an area, and it's a very sort of forgotten area of LA. It's not the new gentrified downtown. It's still very much, oh, those are poor people, who cares? And I felt that it was very important to bring gentrified people out to that, because a lot of our fans, Lee Camp's fans, a lot of Abby Martin's fans are gentrified, middle class or even lower middle class white people. And I thought it was important for them to come out and see, like, hey, this is right next door to you. This area that has been cast aside by the county of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, it's important for you to see that. So there has to be a strategy in where you hold the event as well, because that in and of itself can be a spark of activism for people attending the event. And then, of course, the event in of itself, the Matt Damon video is very popular now because he's like, oh, well, diversity just sort of happens when it happens. And of course, we all know that that's bullshit. And I think you have to consciously think about who is going to be at the event, who you're putting up on stage, because they can speak to people from a space that you can't speak from. And you can speak from a place that they can't speak from. So I think it's really important to have that diversity, again, because it's necessary in movements.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff. You have about 5 minutes left, and what I'd like you to do is just what you feel is the most important thing that you want people to understand about activism and how important it is in our society, and then also tell people where they can find more information about you.
Okay, God, it's sort of like asking me what my favorite song is. So, I mean, I think the most important thing about activism is sort of it's twofold. It's one, like the workout thing that I mentioned, finding something that you can stick with, because activism is a lifelong endeavor. It really is something that you need, just like working out. You need it to be a healthy member of society. You need it to be a healthy citizen. And so you need to find something. And of course it can change. I'm definitely not the same activist today that I was when I first started. It can change, but it has to be something that at the moment you can latch onto and think, I'm really passionate about this. I will stick with this. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you have to find that issue, and which sort of ties into the first point. But I think, well, let me rephrase. You have to understand your own importance in the movements or the movement. I think a lot of people will say things like, oh, I do this and I do that, but I don't really, I mean, either they say, it's not going to really change much, or they say like, oh, it doesn't matter if I don't do anything because, I'm not going to change anything. And that's bullshit. The Howard Zinn quote, one simple act when multiplied by millions of people has the power to change the world, and no government can withstand it. But if all of those one people were to say, fuck it doesn't matter. And I think it's also important to remember that when this country first started, only 6% of the population could vote, and that was white land-owning men. And look at where we are now. We still have a long way to go, but all of those gains that we had, all of the voyage from 6% of voting bloc to what we have today was all taken. It wasn't given to us. And I think it's very important that people remember that. Consider our own history. We have to fight for this. No one's just going to wake up one day and be like, oh, you know what? People should live better. I should do something about that. No politician is ever going to do that. You have to be paying attention, not just around election time, in the interim of the 4 years, because we do have the power to, I mean, it sounds cliche, but the power of the people is greater than the people in power if you exercise it. And so you have to exercise it, again, with the workout thing. Exercise the muscle, flex your rights, because if you don't, they will be taken away from you. They will atrophy. So that's what I think the most, I guess that's a very long-winded answer, but that's what I think is the most important thing about activism. And in terms of where to find me, artkillingapathy.com is sort of the hub of my work. Act Out on Occupy, so you can go to occupy.com/actout. Act Out is also on Facebook, on Twitter, and the band is at rooftoprevolutionaries.com.
Eleanor, thank you so much for coming on. Always appreciate working with you and look forward to working with you in the future. We appreciate you coming on to ActCon 3. The presentation was phenomenal. and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the conference.